Today I want to start off with just thinking about what it feels like to invite people into your homes. I think sometimes it can be scary, right? Especially if you just met the person or it's the first time that they're coming into your house. It can be scary because you have to do all kinds of stuff to get ready. You might have to pick up. If like us, we have 5 kids living at home, and so you have to pick up all of their stuff and hope that they don't come back behind you and destroy the room again, right? And so it's kind of scary, but at the same time, it can be really exciting because you get a chance to meet people, you get a chance to interact with them in a different way than what you normally interact with them. You get a chance to just have fellowship and hospitality with them. A lady learned this by the name of Sarah Harmeyer in 6 years ago, so 2012. She was a part of the Children's Miracle Network out of Dallas, and she retired from that job. She quit her job, and when asked why she did that, she said, well, one of the best years of my life was just operating a business out of my home where I fed people. And so she decided to quit her job that year and to begin to invite people into her home. She had her dad make a 20-person table so that they could all sit around a table and have a meal. She used a website called Nextdoor, and she invited her neighbors. She invited 300 of her neighbors to come. And usually when you get an invite like that, what do? No, I know, that's kind of weird. All right, but 90 people showed up to this meal that she had. And she said as they were coming in and as cars kept coming in the driveway and people kept walking up, she realized something important, that a lot of times people are searching for fellowship and they just need an invitation. And so she took this and she began a organization called Neighborhood Tables, where she goes out and she gets these tables for people that are interested in doing this. And they've done it in 28 states. And they give these tables away and they say, just invite people over and share a meal. Over the last 6 years, she has invited over 3,000 people into her home to share a meal with her. And her goal is by 2020 to have one of these neighborhood tables in every single one of the states. And I think this story is fascinating because how many of us would invite 300 strangers into our home? It's crazy. And they wouldn't fit. Yeah, that's right. You know, and even 90. I can't imagine 90 people fitting in this home. And so, yeah, it's crazy. It's a crazy idea, but I think it's something that our world is desiring. The story that we're going to look at today includes a story of a man coming to Jesus and inviting him into his home. And it's an interesting story because in this encounter that Jesus has, there's an ethnic division between Jesus and this man who is a Gentile. And this division creates a tension in the story that doesn't find resolution until Jesus addresses his followers. The story is found in Matthew chapter 8. If you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to open up with me to Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 5. Matthew 8, 5. And this is the story of a centurion who comes to Jesus and invites Jesus into his home for just a brief moment. Here's how the story begins in verse 5. It said, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Jesus, up to this point in the book of Matthew, has been doing a number of different ministry things. He has actually made his seat of operations in the town of Capernaum, which was the one of the chief governing towns in the region of Galilee. Jesus, just before this, the 3 chapters before this, has gone out into the wilderness onto a mountain, and he's given one of his famous sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, and now has returned home from that. And so this centurion soldier is waiting for Jesus to come. And when Jesus comes back into the town, he is there coming to Jesus, begging Jesus for help. And this is going to be very interesting for a number of reasons. First, the ethnicity of this guy is different, okay? He's not Jewish. He is a Roman soldier. And because he's a Roman soldier, more than likely, he is Gentile. The Roman army at the time, to be a part of it, when you swore allegiance to the Roman emperor, you also had to sacrifice to idols. And so Jews naturally did not join the army because of this. It actually ends up being a point of contention in the early church as well, and you were not a soldier and a Christian because you could not do both. You could not sacrifice to the idols and claim to worship the one true God. And so there's a lot of tension in that. And so this man is a Gentile. He is a worshiper of idols, and yet he's coming to Jesus. And it's very interesting that he would turn to Jesus, this miracle worker, and seek help from him. Now, Jesus has been doing some miracles. And at the very end of chapter 4, he performs a number of miracles. He's been teaching people through chapters 5 through 7. And at the very beginning of chapter 8, he does more miracles. And so these miracles are giving him renown. People are hearing about his name. And the centurion who is stationed in Capernaum, he hears about Jesus. And he comes to Jesus, even though he's not Jewish, even though this is probably the last hope that he has. More than likely, the centurion has searched far and wide for help for the person that he's going to need help with, and yet has found nothing. And Jesus represents the last hope. And so he comes, and he comes to Jesus and he says, I need your help. And so in verse 6, we read exactly what the help is that he needs. Verse 6, he says, Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. So he has a servant back home who is paralyzed, and more than likely he was able to walk. How is he paralyzed? We don't know. Maybe it's an illness. There are diseases that cause you to lose the ability to use your legs. And so it's something there that's causing him not only to not be able to walk, but also to be in pain. And he comes to his Jesus and he asks for help. And again, this is very interesting, because if we understand the Roman world that this takes place in, it would make it even more fascinating that this centurion is taking time out of his life to help his servants. A little bit later, the Roman centurion is going to use a different word for servant, which hints that this man is a slave that he's trying to help. And slaves in the Roman world were not looked on very highly. In fact, they were one of the lowest people in the social status. All right, and children were the only thing that were less than a slave, okay? And a number of Roman writers talk about slaves and how they were treated. And one of the things that comes up over and over again is that the masters of the slaves are the authority, or like the Caesar of the slaves. And if they feel like the slave has done something that is worthy of death, the master had every right to kill the slave. All right, and so this is just kind of where they're at. In fact, there's a treatise on farming equipment. And in that treatise, they said that there's 3 types of farming equipment. There's the inarticulates, there's the articulates, and there's the mute. And when they said, here's how they classify it. A slave is the articulate. They can speak. The animals, the cattle, they're the inarticulate. They can't speak. They can't speak and make sense, right? So they're unable to articulate what they're thinking. And then there's the mute, and that's the equipment, like the plow, right? It can't speak at all. And the only difference between a slave and an animal, or a slave and the plow, is that he can speak. All right, and so this is the general sense of the Roman world. They did not look highly on slaves, and yet here is this centurion who is coming to Jesus because he cares for his slave. Now, this isn't to say that all Romans viewed slaves in this way, all right, but it is the general idea of the Roman world at the time. And so this story, this encounter with Jesus, is fascinating, because not only do you have a Gentile coming to Jesus, but you have a Roman who is caring for somebody that's way lower in a station than him. And he comes to Jesus and says, I need your help. Jesus, you are it. You're the last one that I can trust. Please help me. And he seeks out Jesus to heal his servants. And Jesus asks a question in verse 7. And it's a fascinating question. Here's what he says. He says, "Shall I come and heal him?" Some of your translations might have that as a statement where Jesus says, "I will come." In the Greek, though, it is a question. Shall I come? And Jesus is asking a very difficult question. And a lot of it has to do with the relationship between Gentiles and Jews at the time. See, Jesus is shocked that this soldier is coming to him and saying, "Please come and help my servant." And it's not that Jesus is heartless. It's not that Jesus doesn't care about this slave. Jesus is sitting there asking, "You're wanting me to come?" And it's because of these relationships. Matthew, interestingly, only has Jesus encountering two Gentiles in the entirety of his book until you get to the trials where he has to talk with Pilate. And so in that other account, we kind of get a sense of why Jesus is asking the question here. In that story, a woman comes to Jesus and she has a daughter that's sick, and she asks Jesus, "Will you please heal my daughter?" And Jesus, in response to her, says these words in Matthew 15:24. He says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." And this second story, the only other story of Jesus interacting with the Gentile in the book of Matthew, helps clarify Jesus' question to the centurion all the way back here in chapter 8. Jesus did not come for the Gentiles. He came for the Jews. And this is something that we have to understand about Jesus' ministry. It's not that Jesus doesn't care for the entire world. It's not that his death was not for everyone, all times, everywhere. But Jesus' ministry was for Jewish people. And so this Gentile coming to him is shocking because that's not who Jesus was sent to. All right? The question to enter into the home is fascinating to Jesus because he was not supposed to go there. Now, Matthew, throughout his book, hints at the fact that the Messiah of the Jews will be for all people. The very first story of Gentiles coming to Jesus is the story of the Magi at the birth of Jesus, who are the first ones to come and worship this newborn king. And at the very end of Matthew, Jesus will tell his disciples, "Now go into all the nations." But during his time on earth, he was here for the Jews. Now, Jewish and Gentile relationships were very hostile at times, and actually the closer you got to Jerusalem, the more tension there often was. And a lot of it centered around Jewish beliefs and practices. See, the Jews believed in the one true God and that was the only God that they could worship. They also had practices that kept them from eating certain things. There was dietary laws that they followed. Gentiles, on the other hand, ate whatever they wanted to. And oftentimes the meat that they got were sacrificed to idols before they bought it. And so Jews knew that if they entered into a Gentile house, they would oftentimes be offered food, because part of hospitality is sharing a meal. And in that day, if you came into my house, I would be obligated to offer you a meal. And so if a Jew went into a Gentile's house, a meal would have been shared together, and more than likely the meal would have included things that were against Jewish dietary laws, and therefore the assumption was that if a Jew entered into a Gentile house, they were going to be defiled, and that they would be ceremonially unclean. And here is Jesus, a Jew, fulfilling the law of Moses, being ceremonially clean so that he could be the ultimate sacrifice for the sins of the world. And he is being asked by this Roman centurion, "Please come, enter my house, and heal my slave." And so Jesus asks, "You want me to come? You want me to do this? Do you realize what you're asking me to do?" And there are many examples of Jesus eating with sinners, but they were Jewish sinners. And they probably followed dietary laws and would not have been causing people to become unclean. What's very interesting is that nowhere in the gospel stories does Jesus ever enter into a Gentile's house until you get to the trials where he enters into Pilate's house. Jesus came for the Jews. And his sacrifice is for all people everywhere, but he came to the Jews first because they were the keepers of the promises. And they had the right to accept the Messiah first. The centurion, he's been stationed in Capernaum for a long time. And so he understands the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. And so he's going to, when Jesus asks this question, he's going to respond in verses 8 and 9 with these words. He says, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. And these are words that we shouldn't just skip over. All right. First off, he understands Jewish customs. He says, I am not worthy for you to come into my house. He understands that if you come into my house, Jesus, you are going to be defiled and everyone's going to look at you differently. And I understand that I am not worthy for you to come. And he's been stationed there in Capernaum long enough that he knows what it is. The book of Luke shares this same story, and he says that the Jews of Capernaum respected this man. And so he understands the customs, and he follows it. And even here he says, Jesus, I'm not asking you to become unclean. And I know that you can simply speak, and it will happen. And he talks about the authority that Jesus has over this illness. And this is very interesting. As a centurion, this man would have been part of what's called a legion. The Roman army was divided into a number of different legions, which consisted of about 6,000 men. Each legion had 10 cohorts, each made up of about 600 men, and each cohort had 10 centuria, which was 100 men squads. And a centurion was over one of these 100 men squads. And so this man knows about authority. He has people above him. He has people below him. And so he understands how authority works. And he looks at Jesus and he says, you are a man of authority. And you simply speak and it will take place. And this is remarkable faith. And it's remarkable because as we read the rest of the book of Matthew, we see some very interesting things happen. In fact, this story is sandwiched between two other miracle stories. The story right before this is about a man who has leprosy, which was a terrible and devastating skin disease that was very contagious, and people that had it were often secluded and ostracized from society so that they could not spread it. And this man with leprosy comes to Jesus, and he falls at Jesus' knees, and he says, Jesus, please heal me. And in verse 3 of this chapter, Jesus does this. He reaches out his hand, and he touches the man, and he says, I am willing, be clean. And immediately this man was cleansed of his leprosy. So you have this story of Jesus healing the leper, and then you have the story of the centurion, and then you have this next story that follows where Peter's mother-in-law is sick, and she has an illness that's left her on her bed, and we can probably assume that she's on her deathbed. And Jesus comes in, and in verse 15 of this chapter, he does this. He touches her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. Now notice what Jesus does in both of these healings. What is it? He touches them. And what's really fascinating is as you read the rest of the book of Matthew, anytime there's an individual account of Jesus healing people, Jesus touches them. And here's the centurion who the only thing that he knows is that Jesus needs to touch people to heal them, comes to him and says, no, you don't have to touch my servants. You just need to speak. That is faith. To have a belief that Jesus has authority over something that he's never shown before. And to know that if Jesus just says it, it will happen. There are only two distant miracles in the book of Matthew. They both happen when Gentiles come and interact with Jesus. The faith that this man exhibits is marvelous. And Jesus himself is going to be amazed. In verse 10, Jesus will turn to his disciples, and this is what he says. He says, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and he said to those who are following, his disciples, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in all of Israel with such great faith. And the word there for amazed is the same word that is used anytime that Jesus performs miracles and the crowds are watching. See, Jesus performs miracles and the crowds go, wow. And the same way that Jesus wows the crowd, this man's faith wows Jesus. It is a stronger faith than anything that Jesus has seen to this point in his ministry. He says, nowhere in all of Israel is there faith like this man has right now. And from the person that is least likely to have the type of faith that Jesus is going to be amazed with comes faith. Of all the people that Jesus interacts with, it's a Gentile, someone who doesn't know the promises of God, someone who doesn't know the scriptures and everything that God has been working towards to this point, someone who is far away from God as possible, a soldier who has sacrificed to idols to be a part of his station. This man is the man that has faith in Jesus. And Jesus will turn this man's faith into an object lesson. And it's what we can learn from this encounter. It's something that the disciples needed to learn in their lives. It's something that we need to learn in our lives as well. And here's the object lesson in verses 11 and 12. This is what Jesus says. I say to you, that many will come from east and west, and they will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown out outside into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Common in the first century Judaism at this time was an understanding that when the Messiah came, there would be a great feast. It's to some extent why we celebrate communion every week. This is a sample of the feast that we will celebrate with Jesus when he comes back. And so we take it every week to remind ourselves about Jesus' return. And this feast that the Jews were expecting, they were expecting all of Israel to return. And so they often talked about people coming from the east and the west to sit at this table. The Jews had been dispersed and they would be coming back together. But in context, Jesus declaring that people coming from east and west, he's not talking about Jews. He's talking about Gentiles. And he's saying, you're going to be shocked because people like this man, this Gentile, are going to come from the four corners of the world. And they're going to sit down and they're going to celebrate in the Messiah feast. And then in verse 12, he says that the subjects, and the word is sons, is talking about heirs, the sons and daughters who deserve to be there, whose right it was to be there, they're the ones that will be cast out into darkness. And he's talking about the Jews. And he said, and this is flipping everything that the Jews thought on its head. See, the Jews would have said that the son's position was at the feast with the Messiah. The heirs deserve that. That's what our promises were given to us to have. And for them, it's the Gentiles that are cast out into darkness. And Jesus says that's not it. Ethnicity doesn't matter anymore. What your mom and your dad's, what they did in the past, that's not what determines if you're in the kingdom. Faith determines our status in the kingdom. And this is what Jesus is trying to get across by using this man as an object lesson. That this man, a Gentile who has no right to be here, asking Jesus to come and to heal his servant, this man has faith that allows him to be in the kingdom. And if we want to have lives that are kingdom living, then we need to have faith just like this man. And we forget about this. Sometimes we forget that it's not what our parents believed or what they did for us. Sometimes we think that a choice that we made a while back, that's what determines it. What matters is now. Is our faith allowing us to be in? We get the choice. Our faith determines if we're in or not. And if we don't have faith, then we're not in. And nothing that we've done in the past, nothing that our parents have done in the past, it's not our ethnicity that matters anymore. What matters is what we believe right now. I think there's two ways that this man expresses his faith that we can apply to our lives and that we can show the faith and live out the faith that this man had. The first way this man exhibits his faith is by seeking out Jesus. See, if Jesus had just gone about his day, he would never have encountered this man. And we know that because Jesus says, I came for the Jews. He didn't come seeking out everyone. He came for a certain group of people, the lost sheep of Israel. And this Gentile was not a lost sheep of Israel. He was a Gentile, a foreigner. And so had this man not sought out Jesus, his interaction with Jesus would never have happened. And in our lives, we must be willing to seek out Jesus. We must be willing to recognize that Jesus is all that really matters in the end, and are our lives ones that are seeking him out in everything that we do. One of the ways that we can do this is by searching the Scriptures. It's one of the core values that we have at Kentucky Road. We want Christ to be head over everything that we do because we think that Christ is the King. And his decisions over what the church does is also something important in our lives as well. As individuals, Christ should be head over everything that we do. And so we should be seeking his words, searching the Scriptures. Because these words that were left for us, they're there so that we know what to do in the good times and in the bad times. And if we search through the Scriptures, we can grow in our faith. Paul talks a little bit about this in 2 Timothy chapter 3 when he says these words. He says, from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is God-breathed, and it is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. When we search the Scriptures, and when we apply it to our lives, we can exhibit faith, and it can grow our faith to trust in Jesus that he is what we need. And we can seek him out in the decisions that we make and in the way that we live. The second way that this man exhibits his faith is that he submits to the authority of Jesus. He recognizes that Jesus has power over everything, that Jesus has a power over this illness in his servant, and he's willing to submit himself to Jesus' authority so that his servant can be healed. And in our lives, we need to submit to the authority of Jesus. The very end of Matthew, Jesus is going to say, all power and authority has been given to me. And because of the life that Jesus lived, and because of the sacrifice that he gave, and because of the resurrection that he went through, he has authority. Are we willing to submit to him? See, oftentimes we want to be in control of everything that's going on in our lives. Oftentimes we want to provide for ourselves, but the reality is that Jesus is the one that's in charge. And that if we are not willing to submit to his authority, we're going to find ourselves in a pretty bad situation. So submit. The end of the encounter appears in verse 13. And this is what Jesus says. He turns to the centurion and he says, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed in that moment. And this encounter with Jesus results in everything happening just the way the centurion was seeking. The faith of the centurion determined his status in the kingdom, and it determined whether Jesus was going to help this man or not. And our faith determines if we are in or if we're out. Our faith determines if Jesus is going to help us or if he's not. Do we have faith like the centurion? Are you seeking Jesus in the good times and in the bad? And are you willing to submit to his authority? If you have not submitted to his authority, this is a good time to do it. To be baptized into Jesus, to unite yourself with him, and to allow him to be king over your life. That is what faith is. Seeking him out and submitting to him. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, we're grateful that Jesus is all-powerful and that Jesus had the authority over this illness to heal from a distance, and that this man exhibited such great faith that Jesus would do such a great thing for him. I pray in our lives that we can have the faith like this man, that we can have faith that shows the status of where we're at in the kingdom, that we are yours and that you are ours. We thank you for Jesus. It's his name we pray. Amen.